We know about the engineering failures.
What that has done is caused us to question the integrity of all the other flood walls in the system. We have to go back and check the designs.
We heard about the drive-by levee inspections, with inspectors spending most of the time at lunch.
They call inspection, ride there as fast as you can, look at it, oh yeah, the grass is growing, keep going, let's go.
But Wayne WEISER says everyone missed the real smoking gun.
This is worse than smoking gun. This is like a smoking cannon.
WEISER spent almost 40 years working at the Corps of Engineers, 20 of them as a supervisor of levees and waterways. Bothered by the perception that Corps design issues were the main cause of the levee failures, he spent most of his retirement digging for more info. And here's what he found: an East Jefferson Levee District contract from 1992 that shows the only true picture of what dredging work from 1990 did to the bottom of the canal. And what it shows is devastating.
It shows that the side was eroded like Mr. Chatry had anticipated. And that erosion of taking a channel, bank, and the levee took away all the material that was needed to hold the pollards in place. And when the pollards didn't have nothing to hold them, they collapsed.
Mr. Chatry is Fred Chatry, the late chief engineer of the New Orleans District of the Corps of Engineers. In 1984, he approved a New Orleans Sewerage and Water Board plan to widen the channel in the 17th Street Canal. It was supposed to help with drainage, and it was supposed to be uniform on both banks of the canal. But then Jefferson Parish backed out of the deal. So Chatry wrote this letter in 1988, warning about how dredging on the Orleans side alone could cause scouring on the underwater levee. He directed the project managers to do annual surveys of the canal bottom to make sure. He wrote, quote, "These surveys are required to detect erosion into the control lines, which, if it occurs, could cause failure of the subject levee." Well, the surveys were never done.
New Orleans District, the Orleans Levee Board, both say they didn't know about the annual surveys, and they never received copy of any of it.
So they didn't follow Chatry's directive to do the annual surveys?
It was like one of these documents that goes into the file system, never to be read.
The fact that nobody had checked for erosion was one of the most shocking revelations after Katrina. It came up at this U.S. Senate hearing in December 2005.
Am I hearing that we do not have the capacity to determine whether the kind of structural damage that was occurring over a period of time could have been identified and then prevented? Colonel?
Senator, I believe that, from a visual, we typically do visual inspections. I don't know of any physical inspections that the levee district or the Corps does post-construction.
But what we didn't know until now is that there was one survey of the canal bottom post-construction, and it could have told the local levee district and the Corps that things were not right, if only someone had noticed. This is a cross-section of the canal right at the spot that ended up breaching 13 years later. It was created in 1992 when Jefferson Parish belatedly decided to finally join the dredging project. Look at all the supporting levee material they removed on the Orleans side in 1990. And then this. The red line is the slope of the levee that should have been dredged. And this is how much it went beyond that line in just 2 years.
About 4 feet deeper than it should have been in this area right here.
Bob Turner, regional director for the local levee authority, says dredging contractors would have been paid for any material they removed up to that line, nothing beyond it. He says it's unclear whether it was over-dredged or if it eroded.
Chatry's predictions and fears were actually well-founded.
That's Cal Berkeley engineering professor Bob B. He led one of several independent groups that performed exhaustive studies of what went wrong. None of them located the survey drawings WEISER found.
That's new information that helps us understand now much better why the breach took place on the Orleans Parish side. I think it's clear that it was a substantial contributor. It couldn't or shouldn't have been ignored.
If anybody had looked at those drawings, they might have seen the problems developing. Instead, no further surveys were done on the Orleans side of the canal until 2 years after Katrina. And on the Jefferson side, there was so little information that the Corps' own investigators weren't even sure if the dredging was done. The East Jefferson Levee District insists the dredging work was completed in 1994. Even then, the design called for berms on the Jefferson side, not on the Orleans side. You can still see the difference today. Jefferson, Orleans.
Soil that was left or placed over on the Jefferson Parish side had a very, very important effect in providing the margin of safety that kept that levee intact on that side.
On the other hand, the floodwalls on the Orleans side go deeper into the ground than the ones on the Jefferson side, which is why the Corps of Engineers is concerned about erosion on the Jefferson side now.
We looked at surveys we had from 2009 and 2013, and we identified one area of the canal that had erosion at a rate that concerned us.
So the Corps is doing extra armoring, laying scour stones on the Jefferson side. It's also driven deeper sheet piles and, most importantly, can use temporary pumps at the lakefront to control water levels during a storm.
Before, the sewage and water would be pumping, the water levels in the lake would be rising, and that would cause a somewhat uncontrolled rise in the water levels in the canal, whereas now we've got complete control about how high that water can get.
When the Corps is done, it will turn the job over to the state with explicit instructions on how to survey and maintain the canal. Regional Levee Authority Director Bob Turner says they're ready this time.
A more than normal amount of care has been taken to investigate those areas and determine whether or not there were any issues left to be dealt with. And then, once those issues were ferreted out, the actual work was done.
But B says the fact that important documents went unnoticed and directives went unfollowed all those years before Katrina just goes to prove that residents need to remain vigilant.
I would say they can feel safer, and that's because we're actually working to control the water that is allowed to accumulate in the 17th Street Canal. But the question is, are you safe enough? And that question for me is not answered.